Activists in Singapore have welcomed the government's announcement today that it plans to decriminalize sex between men. The reversal of a colonial-era law known as Section 377A comes after years of campaigning by gay rights groups. But decriminalization does not mean equality. The government now says it also plans to amend the Constitution to make it impossible for same-sex couples to marry.
The government will repeal Section 377.
A surprise announcement by Singapore's Prime Minister, met with jubilation and applause. The rolling back of a law that made sex between men punishable by up to 2 years in jail.
Singaporeans still have differing views on whether homosexuality is right or wrong, but most people accept that a person's sexual orientation and behavior is a private and personal matter, and that sex between men should not be a criminal offence.
The move has been welcomed by many who say it's time to bring the law up to date.
Actually, I've got a lot of gay friends, so I kind of feel that it is something that is totally justifiable. Yeah.
While the colonial-era law banned sex between men, LGBTQ groups said the law amounted to state-sanctioned discrimination against the entire gay community.
Please, Prime Minister Lee, lead us. Tear down this law.
It means Singapore joins a growing list of Asian nations, including India, Thailand and Taiwan, to liberalise their laws on homosexuality. But following pressure from religious groups, the government says it has no plans to change its legal definition of marriage as being between a man and woman. Some rights groups are disappointed.
What the government has done is to say that discrimination against LGBT people is acceptable. Cementing this discrimination in the supreme law of Singapore has huge ramifications for other kinds of rights and other policies which affect LGBT people.
So while repealing the ban on gay sex is being hailed as a triumph of love over fear, rights groups warn the Lion City still has a long way to go to full equality.
Maria Schoeden is the executive director at Outright Action International. That is a group advocating for human rights for LGBTIQ people across the globe. Maria, it's good to have you on the program tonight. We've got a situation in Singapore that's it's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? We've got the government saying that sex between men is no longer a crime, and at the same time it says it plans to amend the Constitution to make it impossible for same-sex couples to get married.
Yeah, but I still think we have to celebrate this as a first victory. It is an incredibly important step that Singapore is now ridding itself of the colonial era law that has been in place for, almost 100 years, even though we know that there is still a long way to go to protect full equality for LGBTQ people in Singapore.
Talk to me a little bit about the legacy of colonial legislation in the oppression of the LGBTQ community. We know that in the 20th century, when we had former British colonies who were gaining their independence, they were taking laws that came from some of the most homophobic legislation that was ever passed by the UK. Are we still dealing with that in these former colonies?
Yeah, absolutely. Same-sex relations are a crime in almost 70 countries, and in almost all of the situations, it is a result of penal codes that originally were imposed by colonial powers. And so while this number is slowly decreasing, most recently there was a court decision in Antigua and Barbuda that overturned the colonial era penal code there. And of course, now we have the announcement in Singapore from yesterday. So there is a slow movement towards decriminalization. Not everywhere. There's also an ongoing backlash in some places, but overwhelmingly, we see countries one by one in a slow trickle decriminalize. And I have to say that none of this ever comes without community organizing, that where organizations and activists are pushing for this change and creating and building a change in societal attitudes, also using courts strategically, similar to what was happening in Singapore. There have been court cases that did not decriminalize in that case, but that have been building towards this announcement to decriminalize in Singapore. And I think that knowing that the activism that goes into it, it's not something that happens suddenly. No one is sort of, I think, surprised when, if you're following these issues, you're not surprised when something like this happens because you have seen the years and decades of activism that has gone into creating that change.
If we look at all of Asia, Taiwan remains the only country where same-sex marriage is legal. So what does this move by Singapore, what does it signal, or how does it fit in to this progression, if you will?
Knowing that decriminalization is a critical, maybe not a first step necessarily. I mean, you can have some recognition actually of rights even without decriminalization, but it is an incredibly important step, even in a situation like Singapore, where people weren't necessarily arrested for committing a crime. It still has a very chilling effect on people's lives, and it's hard to move beyond and secure, full equal rights and non-discrimination in schools, workplaces, even in families, if you live under this kind of colonial era law. So I think, of course, it's very unfortunate that the Singaporean Prime Minister announced that he wants to impose a ban on same-sex marriage, even though marriage wouldn't necessarily be sort of the next legal step that people would absolutely be asking for. Of course, it's a bad sign to already start to say, well, we're not going to grant full rights.
And we are talking about a part of the world where LGBTQ rights and protections are not high on the agenda, perhaps even where the opposite is the case. I mean, just consider what the Taliban has done in the last year in Afghanistan. And considering all of that, what is your message to people tonight who are watching from Japan to the Philippines to Vietnam? What would you like for them to take away from the news today?
I mean, LGBTIQ people exist everywhere, and so are human rights and the protection of them. They need to be on the agenda everywhere. And organizing LGBTIQ activists to push for that recognition, that is really, in my opinion, the best way forward. And I mean, outright, we have over 30 years experience working on these issues, so we have seen a lot of progress in that time, even though there's still a lot of backlash and in some places almost no conversation at all. Yeah. But we have seen how there are more and more countries where where people are organizing and they're starting to push for their rights. And there's no doubt in my mind that, eventually we will get there for every corner of the world. We exist everywhere. Okay. So, of course, we have to have our rights recognized everywhere.
Maria Zodin, Executive Director at Outright Action International. Maria, we are out of time. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.